Greetings, my name is Jean-Michel. I'm a Vedic astrologer, and today I'm going to be talking about the differences and similarities between astrological therapy and traditional therapy. And this is going to be the first video in a playlist about how astrology works on a more conceptual level, and it's meant for therapists, counselors, and clinical psychologists who want to incorporate astrology into their practice. And this is all in preparation for a course that I'm preparing about how for these people to use astrology in their practice without actually having to tell the client they're doing astrology and without actually having to ask the birth time and read the natal chart. And it sounds like, oh wow, how do I do astrology without reading a chart? Well, chart reading is absolutely essential to understand the fundamentals of how astrology works. But when you're in a clinical setting, sometimes there are restrictions about what techniques you can use. And so for these people, you're going to be able to hear keywords and understand important behaviors that reflect specific astrological conditions. And so, as I said, you're going to be able to train yourself to be able to hear what the client is saying in astrological language. So if you're interested in that course, go to my website, jmvedic.com, sign up for my newsletter, and you'll be informed when that course is available. So a little bit of background on how I came to do astrology. Well, I started studying Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud when I was 16 in preparation for an advanced placement psychology class in high school. And so I didn't have to study, I got the credits and I didn't have to study in university psychological courses, the beginning courses. In university, what I did study was comparative world literature, anthropology, and film directing. And what I was most interested in was how cultures from across the world, how they portray their own experiences through fiction and through storytelling. So I went to New York City and I did film and theater directing for about 8 years. And my favorite part about writing and then performing pieces and shooting and taking part in the theatrical process was developing the characters and understanding what is motivating that character to live out their particular trajectory in the story. So they have a motivation, and how are they developing as a person? And my absolute favorite part is working with the actors, because when you're working with actors, you're digging into their own emotional experiences and helping them to adapt themselves into the persona that you're creating for the stage or for the film. So this all has to do with a deep analysis of how humans behave. What are the tics? What are the patterns of behavior? And how do you create a realism within a fictional story about psychological tendencies? And eventually, in my later 20s, I discovered astrology, and I didn't know very much about it. But since I have such a strong push to understanding why humans and people do what they do, I dug deeper and deeper. And now I've been doing astrology for over 5 years and have many clients. And the more you do astrology, the more precise you become in seeing that the position of the sky the moment you are born and also transits have a very important impact on your overall well-being and your mental health. And so that's how I came to do astrology, but it's always been a fascination with how humans think, why they think the way they do, and coming as close as you can to the truth of how things are. Because I remember studying astrology or studying psychology, seeing the different theoretical systems and wondering, okay, this person has set up these 5 main criteria about how humans are. But how do you know that person is not forgetting something here or there? And so the man-made systems of psychology, to me, always felt somewhat limited. So I've always been looking for a more fundamental truth, so to say, about how we operate as human beings on a psychological level. So that's how I came to astrology. And so first I want to talk about a very important similarity between these therapeutic methods, astrology and what we can say is traditional psychological counseling. And that is that they're both a science. Astrology has this reputation of being this occult mysticism and interpretive kind of hodgepodge of different theories and traditions. But astrology is based on mathematics, and it's based on precise locations of the celestial phenomena. And the more precise you are with those calculations, and the more precise your techniques are, the more precise you can be with how the behavioral results will be. And astrology is very much a science because what you're doing is observing the world around you, and you're coming to see patterns in how the world operates, and then you're coming to conclusions based on those patterns. That's the same way that we're trained to use any kind of science, is that you have to observe the world, experiment with how that world is operating, and then come to conclusions. So it's very important from the beginning, when you approach astrology, don't separate it from how you already approach your psychological practice and how you approach especially the diagnostic element of your practice, and looking for the patterns of behavior and then saying, okay, this is this condition, and etc. Astrology is very much the same. We shouldn't treat it as something that's too mystical. It's very much rooted in practical results. And that's why predictions can be so accurate, because the more precise you are with your mathematics and your techniques, the more precise you can be with the results that you see in life. And so always treat astrology as another form of science. And we'll get into a little bit more at the end of this video on how it is actually a spiritual science and what that means. So a difference between astrology and psychology is that astrology is very ancient. All cultures had some way of interpreting how the celestial phenomenon were interacting with human life. Psychology is about 150 years old. In the mid-1800s, through literature, the works of Henry James, and many others, the examination of psychological process started to gain more mainstream traction. And then, of course, the schools of psychology were created during the 20th century. So psychology is very much a modern way of studying the human mind, whereas astrology is an ancient form of studying the interactions of energies throughout the world and how they affect human life. But astrology was not used in the way that we use it today. It was used for predicting events. It was almost never used as a way of, oh wow, this person has this condition, well, how do you can make your life better and more psychologically bearable? No, it was used to show, oh, and especially in Vedic texts, if you have this alignment, and this alignment, you will have this. So predicting behavior and not analyzing the behavior and then improving the behavior. The reason why astrology is now used in such a capacity for improving mental health is because of the influence and interest of the world in psychology. So they actually are merging in a certain sense. And that's why it's so useful for a therapist trained in the traditional methods that you learn in university, getting a master's degree, and through practical experience. That's why it's so important to use astrology, is because now astrology is a very profound tool that has developed over many millennia to become what it is today. And so I want to make that very important emphasis that now we can use what we've learned through psychology and apply it with the astrological principles. Because when I talk about psychology, it's not to bash psychology and to say that it's obsolete. It's not obsolete. It has many flaws, and some are fatal flaws that will only cause more difficulty in diagnostics and also therapy and also the solutions. But we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can learn so much from where psychology has taken the past 100 years to develop, but astrology has the capacity to open that up into a bigger and bigger expansive way of diagnostics and treatment. So a difference between the two is that in psychology we have a very hierarchical system, and that system is but it is ruled over by the Bible, the DSM-5, or you can say it's a dictionary. And that diagnostic handbook has so much power that it's very hard to operate outside of its influence. But the DSM-5 is very problematic because it was written with non-disclosure agreements. People couldn't talk about how they came to certain conclusions. There was a politicization of it, and certain political agendas getting inserted into it. And none of that is going to end up with fruitful results. And not to mention the financial incentives and the compromising financial system, the compromised nature of what the hierarchy of the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, the conflicts of interest with those manuals and how you actually treat a person in front of you. So psychology has this very difficult positioning and very structured way of doing it. And if you're a practicing psychologist, you're very much aware of what I'm talking about. Astrology, on the other hand, is much more loose. And technically, you could study a little bit of techniques here and there, and you can already start practicing and seeing astrology work around you. And that's why some therapists like to use it, because it doesn't require a degree to feel like, oh, I got it, I understand it. It's always recommended to learn from a teacher how to do astrology in a practical sense, but you can just pick up books, start learning, and then you can start applying it to your life. There's a much less of a emphasis on that you need to be accredited. So it's a much more looser way of being able to bring in a new technique into your toolbox. So one of the major criticisms of psychology, and specifically the DSM-5, is the biological reductionism and the heavy emphasis on neuroscience. And the idea is that by advances in neuroscience, we can come to exact reasons why a person has a specific diagnosis, or they behave in a certain way because of this chemical imbalance or this chemical balance. So as psychology is growing these days, it's becoming very much reductive and very literal. Astrology, as I've been saying, mathematically, we can come to specific conclusions about, or specific diagnostics about, this is happening in your life, and we can see that because of this placement. Or just the way you explain it, I can see that you're having this problem. But astrology is expansive, and there really is no limit to the ways that you can improve your life just by understanding how astrology works and a mastery of the fundamentals. So while so this is a major difference between the approach of psychology and astrology, is that the psychological world is honing in on specific neuroscientific advancements, while in astrology we're not just honing in and deducing and getting down to a specific imbalance and then saying we're reducing down to an extreme degree. Astrology has the ability to expand one's ability to understand why things are happening. So there's an expansive quality, and that deals with the spiritual element, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And another big difference about psychology and astrology is that there is a very heavy emphasis in the psychological world on problem-centered therapy, which is the over-analysis on what the problem is and essentially laying in that problem, or making your bed, and that bed is a set of problems, and then laying in it every night. But the weakness of psychological therapy is the lack of emphasis on an institutional level of solution-centered therapy. And astrology has a whole range of solutions embedded into its practice, such as meditation, contemplation, and absorbing the ideas and expanding your knowledge base, Bach flower remedies, and other techniques that I'm going to be talking about in this playlist, such as embodying the exalted forms of what those harmed planets in a chart, or when you're having a certain difficulty in a certain area of your mental world, you then project the most positive and the best and healthiest form of that problem in order to create healthier habits. So in psychology, that overemphasis on honing in and overanalyzing the problem and seeing yourself as inseparated from that problem, it becomes very debilitating, and people can become absorbed and obsessed with trauma instead of actually overcoming the traumas. And the other major criticism is that because of the conflicts of interest in the institutional psychology is, of course, the use of synthetic medications and drugs in order to correct or move the imbalances that are happening on a cerebral level in the actual brain matter. And the dependence on synthetic drugs, unfortunately, is becoming more and more commonplace. Astrology, we don't use those techniques, and I'm not saying that synthetic medications don't have a place for some people's lives. They absolutely do. And some people, we're talking about extreme cases. So it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as I said. There are extreme cases that need that kind of more extreme attention. But what I'm talking about is clinical psychologists who are dealing with milder cases and can see that it's possible for that person to improve. And so one of the other major solutions for embedded into astrology is the importance of self-effort, because when a person comes to the office, they're already taking that first step to improve themselves, and they want to be better. They're not okay with who they are. Some people will never admit they have a problem, and they'll just fester in their problems. Say a covert narcissist, someone that they're not going to be treated. They don't want to be treated, and they're going to live their life in that way. Someone that comes to your office that is seeking help, they want to improve, and so self-effort and understanding what your diagnosis is, and then working with self-effort to improve it, and then which leads to self-knowledge and to understand yourself on a deeper level. So that's another solution-centered therapy that astrology has embedded within it that doesn't get emphasized enough in psychological therapy. Which brings me to the final subject I wanted to cover, is that astrology is a spiritual science. And one major flaw in psychology is that it doesn't discuss the soul. And what is the soul? It's a part of us that is eternal, because when our body dies, there's a part of us that doesn't die. And that is a completely foreign concept in the institutional practice of psychology. It's just not addressed. Spiritual traditions have that embedded into its understanding, that there is a part of us that is divine or immaterial. There's an element to us that is not just flesh and bone. And so astrology has this embedded concept or embedded fact to it, is that we are all spiritual beings, and that there is a purpose to life, and that where we're born and how we're born has more to do than just the luck of the draw. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that idea of the luck of the draw and what samskaras are in a follow-up video, because that's a whole nother important subject about how astrology actually works. But as a spiritual science, we are learning about ourselves, but it's important to understand that you are not your problems. You are not your name, you are not your gender, you are not any of the things that people traditionally give as their identity. You are a divine being living in a material life. And that material life is set with certain circumstances and set with certain challenges and certain abilities and certain advantages that each person has. So astrology is taking and expanding on and seeing our life from a higher level, a more spiritual level, a level where when we die, we don't just go into the ground, and that there is something beyond what we call our day-to-day life. And that is a very big subject, but it's important to emphasize that psychology does not approach that aspect of human life enough. It wants to separate out religious beliefs, which can be very harmful in a person's life, but when you're not addressing the yearning of human beings to see something bigger in their lives beyond just their simple human self, their single personhood, and when you're not connecting that single person with everything else around them and seeing that they're inseparable from the rest of existence, it doesn't approach, that yearning that that person is having of seeing themselves in a larger context. And that's what astrology does on a big, big level. It probes deep into the ability to see yourself beyond your single personhood. And so it's something that psychologists who are watching videos such as this or want to use astrology, they see that there's something, they have a belief that there's something bigger than simple material existence. There's something larger going on. There's energy that we can't see, feel, or touch, but it exists, and it's influencing our lives. And so that is a major component and a major difference between astrological counseling and astrological therapy and traditional psychological therapy. So stay tuned for more videos about these kinds of practical how-tos about how astrology works, and also sign up for my newsletter for when I'm going to be releasing this course about the techniques about how to incorporate astrology into your clinical practice. And as I said, stay tuned. I'm going to be putting a lot more videos that approach these subjects of the conceptual basis of how we start off understanding and then using astrology in a mental health capacity. Okay, thank you.